Hello, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Lillian, and today I'm going to be talking to you about my creative writing piece for the online literary magazine. My creative writing subject is publishing this week, which, despite my best efforts, was not named Tabula Rasa or Welcome to Hellmouth or all of the lyrics of Walk Through the Fire, because apparently Buffy's not hip with the kids anymore. It's called Isolation Publication, and the short story I made for it is The Climbing Wall. Technically speaking, the origins of the story date back to years ago, to this comic thing when Eddie was much more of a narcissist and much more interested in being better at Lana than tennis than being a decent boyfriend, and he targets her brother, the cello player, because she won't give him back a necklace, but Lana sucked as well and acted to intentionally sabotage him in some weird alternative scenario where she hurts her own arm and blames it on him, or possibly that's some story Eddie's making up to justify his actions. This bit of my novel whip, for example, makes it seem like Eddie hit Lana with a tennis racket, except he's not really meant to be a violent character. Impulsive, yes. Self-destructive, yes, but not violent. So basically, the goal of The Climbing Wall was to rewrite this incident, to put them both in a more positive light, show that they've learned and that they actually do care about each other, to work on all the character development I've tried to give them in the years since writing these weird stuff. At the end of January, I wrote my first version of The Climbing Wall. This was before I started the subject and was just for fun, for me to really get to know Lana's character better. The first version features a lot less action and skims over the second grade climbing wall incident quite quickly. It didn't have the scene where he pushes her off the wall when they're in high school, or the subsequent reconciliation. It sort of has a different transition where the girls who play families start having fake weddings instead because they think it's cool to pretend to marry the kid with battle scars. Lana's crude toughness is a little bit overemphasized. Knees grazed, hands grazed. I was gonna keep up with the boys even if it killed me. I preferred the grimy and gross ones, even though they were bullies, because I liked that they could put up a good fight, that they didn't whine like babies. Edmund was the biggest crybaby of any of the boys, which made him easily the most annoying. Lana's a lot meaner to Eddie here, but it's somewhat justified of her being upset at the attention the girls are giving him, the fact that the incident made him more popular, and she ends up trying to apologize, and they get fake married, and then it skips to their high school graduation where their relationship isn't exactly in the best condition, and just sort of extends onwards to the fractured nostalgia of her 18th birthday when she's not really sure how things are gonna go between them, but that was all way too long ago, and I wanted to leave things on a more hopeful note. A bit earlier on in the time frame, it's still recognizable as the story, and some sentences are surprisingly really similar to the end result, such as, when second grade began, Kane started first grade and made himself an instant target for getting shoved down the slide. I stood at the top of the slide with the biggest stick I could find and pushed the brutes all back down the climbing wall until my detentions became a suspension. So, yeah, that sentence has only changed a little bit in the final version. Which brings us to the second version, where I started putting in some more detail about her position on the climbing wall. It was a good lookout spot. There were the boys who danced around with a soccer ball, and the boys who hit cricket balls over the fence, and the girls who sat in groups of 8 playing hand-clapping games and gossiping. I was the omniscient, watching onwards between every poke and thud. I ended up cutting out that detail probably by the next version, to focus on the boys trying to get up the climbing wall and the girls who were cartwheeling and playing family, because it didn't really matter like what all the rest of the kids were doing, because the focus was on like the ones who were being horrible people. We also start to see some more key sentences that made it to the end result. Notably, in this version, I was a fallen warrior. In the days I had been forced away, the boys had ravaged my castle and torn apart my defenses. Ends up leading into her witnessing one of Eddie's fake weddings, and it's a bit less chronological because she then thinks about back to what if she had helped him up and onto the climbing wall instead of shoving him off or whatever. Then we get the transition from 2nd to 11th grade. Christmas time, her parents' fractured relationship, the water guns. Once again, it goes into way more detail, talking about a couple of Eddie's sisters, her brother, some of their friends, some of their other hobbies, like the fact Eddie plays cello and they try to start a why did I write rock bank? They try to start a rock band and Eddie almost blows up a chemistry lab. Fun story for another day. When we get to the high school incident of their argument on the playground, it brings up Eddie's insecurity issues in specific relation to his siblings. So, the third version, we start with the aftermath of the high school incident. She's just fallen off, or was pushed off the playground and is freaking out about her arm. And then we get our flashback to 2nd grade where it's quite similar to the previous version, but now we get some dialogue from the girls terrorizing Eddie. We also start to get the detail of future versions of Eddie's attempt to scale the wall and Lana being the hero's downfall, with some lines like, he looked ridiculous with his hair half tied in braids and a frangipani stuck behind each ear that flew off as he leapt onto the tarmac, being good enough to make the final version. As far as I can tell, version 4 is very close to version 3, except I made everything that happened in the past be in italics, and I cut out a few things like my description of what the other kids on the playground were doing, and I added a scene where she previously tried to approach Eddie but was too scared to try to be his friend. And then I finally started trying to figure out my reconciliation ending. In version 5. I was scrolling through version 5 trying to find a difference to version 4 when I realized this is when he gets rejected instead of getting popular. This is when there's no more fake weddings. This is when she attempts to cartwheel again and he notices and is sympathetic towards her. And you start to see evidence of Lana's parents' fractured relationship when she's struggling to write an apology for Eddie at home. Version 6 starts right off the bat with a paragraph full of pretty metaphors and stuff that there was no way I was going to be able to afford to keep. We get her sulking on the drive home after pushing Eddie off the climbing wall and having to overhear her parents argue when she's at home, and her remembering the other girls being cruel to her for not being able to cartwheel. We start to give her unicorn toy a lot more significance because we see how important it is to her, and the fact that she gives it to him shows how much she trusts him now and how important he is to her. I also cut off the reconciliation scene at the end of it because it had started to waffle on. Version 7. Here I've restructured again, starting with the argument on the playground where they're in high school, then her reaction to having fallen, and then the flashback. I had to cut out a ton to get to the 1,500 word limit. This meant cutting it off after she's tried to cartwheel and he's just reassured her, so cutting out writing the apology and the conversation they have the next day, and then cutting out all the in-between stuff, Christmas time, 3rd grade, 6th grade, them starting to play tennis, then becoming a couple, all of that, just straight to the short and sweet reconciliation scene. And then version 8. So at this point I've more or less reached the point of my final creative draft, the first assessment piece. So just a few little touch-ups and adding the artist statement explaining how this was inspired by an edgy emo rock song. Mum told me to change it from them being in 10th grade to them being in 12th grade because 10th graders wouldn't say I love you, but then I realized later that that actually screws with a bunch of other stuff in the wider context of my novel Whip, which is set in 10th grade after the incident, and that mostly matters because Eddie's older brother was in 12th grade at that point, and yeah, anyway. The first thing I did when I got the assessment back was admittedly re-adding in all that stuff that happened between 2nd grade and high school and refining it. Because it was important characterization, and now I had an extra 1,000 words I could use for the Litmag version of the story, and I was gonna make the most of it. I also restructured it back to being more chronological and added more comments about her feelings of the situation. Also the meta bit at the end where she finds out what Eddie thinks of her story. I thought it'd be quite funny that she's gone to all this effort to write 2,500 words to justify herself, and he summarizes it in a sentence. Also, in the earlier version of this, she wants to know if he had pushed her off the climbing wall if she had helped him up in 2nd grade, but I thought that would be too much for them to talk about. I ended it initially on I'm good at believing things I shouldn't, as a sort of hint to the audience that they couldn't necessarily take the story at face value. My main feedback was to cut down on unnecessary characters and make it clear who's talking in conversation, so I worked on that. And now the girls in the cartwheel gang were nameless, and the kid who was on the climbing wall, the same time Eddie was trying to get up, I basically cut out altogether. Various additional feedback pointed out certain scenes which were confusing, so I tried to fix up those. But I also want to be careful not to make things too obvious. I didn't just want to say I tried to cartwheel again, but just describe what that looked like and her reaction to her failure. So there we go. I would have read every single version or explained it in extreme detail, but that would have gotten boring and repetitive way too quickly. I'm only realizing after writing the script that this probably isn't very exciting or easy to follow either, but I hope it was, because all this was a lot of work. There's a link to the Lit Mag down below where you can read my story and all the other excellent creative writing of my classmates, and I hope to see you next time where we can discuss why the Lit Mag should have definitely been called Buffy vs. Dracula. Check me out on my Insta and Quora, and remember that linear regression is the secret to time travel.